you about South Africa, a place with a violent past and a joyful spirit, a place where grandmothers who have lost children to AIDS laugh and smile at the teenagers beating their steel drums, a place where children with no shoes dance in the street to music from an electric piano, a place full of pain and love and joy. That was what I saw and felt when I visited South Africa. I traveled to South Africa in the spring of 2004, a little over 10 years ago, and about 10 years after the end of apartheid. The honors program at Westchester University, which I was a part of, had made it a tradition to go to South Africa about every 4 years. I was a sophomore in college at the time and had traveled all over the country, to England and Puerto Rico, but had never been to Africa, and I figured the opportunity to go would not come again soon. So I, of course, enthusiastically signed up, delved into the assigned readings, watched all the assigned movies, and by the day of departure could not wait to get there and immerse myself in a new culture and explore a new place. South Africa surprised and touched me, though, like no other place has before or since. And it was, of course, the people that touched and taught me the most. The most important lesson they taught me, through their spirit and their lives, was perhaps the nature of happiness. Now, for the majority of the trip, I was very happy. Joyous, really, on more than one occasion. I have always been a person that loves meeting and connecting with people, and this trip gave me plenty of opportunity to do that. We spent most of our time in Cape Town, working to create a needs assessment for a community center. To achieve that aim, we spent one day interviewing grandmothers of the community, and I'll explain later why we chose the grandmothers. And to help us better understand the community, we played a soccer game with local children, took a tour of the neighborhood, had a wonderful dinner in a local person's home, worked at a soup kitchen, and visited the schools. One of my favorite memories of this time was the dinner in the local person's home. The home was tiny, and every square foot of the building was taken up by seats and tables. We knocked elbows with each other as we ate the delicious homemade food, and all you could hear were stories and laughter, and all you could see was smiling faces. It was one of our first days in South Africa, and besides the food, everyone was also feeding off of each other's excitement. After dinner, we moved outside onto the dusty, sun-filled street. Someone brought out an electric piano, and all the neighborhood children, who knew we were there by the side of our big bus, came running up to meet the Americans. The children started dancing with us, asking us to take their pictures, pulling our faces closer to theirs so we could be in the picture too, clapping their hands to the music, showing off dance moves. Some of the adults joined in, and suddenly what had been a small gathering of foreigners with one tour guide became a neighborhood dance party. The excitement and happiness we felt at dinner bubbled over and turned into pure joy. To this day, I look back on this moment as one of the brightest and happiest of my life. The next day was different. After our first full day in South Africa, I couldn't sleep from happiness, and when I did sleep, I'm sure it was with a smile on my face. At the end of the second day, I was again alone in my room, but sobbing, and sobbing, and sobbing as hard as I've ever cried in my life. And I kept asking myself, how? How can I be so happy? I was not able to answer that question on the trip, but over 10 years later, I think I might have figured out at least part of the answer of what happiness is and why they were happy. Before I talk about what I think happiness is, let me talk about what I think happiness is not. And the first thing is that happiness is not material items. And I think most of you use, and to be honest, most of the people I know outside of the church as well, we know this. But can you imagine being happy, living in a house like this? Or in a neighborhood like this? These are pictures of shanty towns, and to be honest, in this case, the image really can't quite capture capture what it was like to be there. We visited the shantytowns on our first day in South Africa, the day we went from the height of a charter bus. On our second day in South Africa, the day we interviewed the grandmothers, we viewed it from the eyes of the people, on foot and in cars. Similar to some American city neighborhoods, in the shantytowns outside of Cape Town, there was trash everywhere and a slight smell of urine. The streets were mostly made of dirt. After all, these were neighborhoods built by the people, not the city. And the shacks were made out of whatever people could find. Wood and tin were the sturdiest, but we also saw buildings with cardboard and tarps for some of the walls. Many people walked barefoot, perhaps from custom more than poverty. And at the end of the streets, most people were trying to sell items to each other from tables and stands. Also similar to some American cities, the shanty towns were segregated. The segregation had started under apartheid, and though apartheid was over when we visited, the only people who appeared to live in these neighborhoods were blacks. And the shanty towns stretched as far as the eye could see, containing thousands and thousands of people. Now, what I described was South Africa 10 years ago. The situation has changed little today, except now everyone has cell phones. According to Statistics South Africa, it is estimated that over half of South Africa's population could be classified as financially poor, and over 20% of the population live in extreme poverty, which means they struggle to feed themselves and their family. That's 1 out of every 5 people. The grandmothers we interviewed were definitely extremely poor, and speaking with them gave us some insight into what it was like to live in that kind of poverty. They spoke of needing to find money to pay for school fees, pay doctor's bills. One woman, to quote, said, "It is difficult to find shoes for the children in school because we still have to pay for medicine for the one who is sick." Can you imagine having to choose between shoes for the children and medicine for the sick? This grandmother lived in a house with 17 people, only one of whom worked outside the home making money. The government helped a little, but sometimes the money ran out before the month was over, and then the grandmother had to go into debt to keep the family fed. When the children were hungry, she told them to drink sugar water. Local organizations, such as churches and some community centers, help when they can. We spent one morning volunteering in a soup kitchen, and it was shocking and sad to see the men start lining up, silent, waiting patiently for their turn. What was even more touching was to see the men insist that the women and children go ahead of them in the line. When it was finally their turn, a mother and a baby arrived late. The men stopped getting served and ushered, with smiles and encouraging words, the young mother with the baby to the front of the line. These men had, in spite of their poverty, maintained their dignity. Along with the poverty, we also saw dignity everywhere in the shanty towns. The women who knew they would be meeting us, from the tour guide's wife to the grandmothers, wore impeccably clean, brightly colored clothes and walked with their heads held high. We saw countless women sweeping the dirt in front of their shanties, keeping the small home they had as clean as possible. When we were given the chance to visit some of the homes of the grandmothers, they proudly showed us their kitchens with cracked tiles, their backyards full of junk, and the family photographs on the mantelpiece, just the way someone in America would show a foreigner their home. We also saw a lot of happy people, or at least people happy in the moment in the townships. We saw lots of smiles and laughter from the car windows, and the children were always laughing and smiling with us. And our conversations with the grandmothers ended in laughter. In spite of their poverty, these people knew how to be happy. Happiness is definitely not in material objects. One thing that happiness may come from, though, is being part of a community. As mentioned before, I know I feel joy when I am connecting with other people, and the most joyful times of my trip were when our group was welcomed with open arms into the community. Dancing out in the street after dinner was certainly one example of a time like that. Another time, though, happened in the classroom. We were visiting a school and had just served the children of the school their one meal of the day. One meal of the entire day. They did not always get breakfast or dinner at home. The children in the classroom I visited were in brightly colored uniforms and about 10 years old. There were over 30 students in the class, and all the desks were taken, so we sat on the floor in the front of the room. Their teacher, a middle-aged, dynamic man, walked up up and down the aisles, asking the children questions and calling them by name. The students were well behaved, but then again, we were there, and clearly respected this man. At the end of the class, just before we had to leave, he had the children teach us a song. I'm H-A-P-P-Y, I'm H-A-P-P-Y, I know I am, I'm sure I am, I'm H-A-P-P-Y. The students then joined us in the front of the room, and with shining eyes, put their arms around each other and us, gave big, genuine smiles as someone took our picture from the back of the room. What a community, and how blessed I felt to be part of it, if only for half an hour. While I'm sure that, like all students, there were days when the kids in the class would rather not be in school, they also clearly loved being part of the community in that teacher's classroom. Just like the dignity, we saw evidence of love of community everywhere too. Very few people were walking alone in the shanty towns, and when people greet each other, it was usually with a smile. The children loved being part of the local soccer league, and the teenage boys loved playing steel drums together. The community center we were working with was clearly loved too. One grandmother in particular talked about how much she loved the center. I live next door, she said. I know what is happening. There are always noises, singing, dancing. Everyone seems very happy to be there. In South Africa, though, and in other African countries as well, the sense of community is far more ingrained in the culture than in America. Has anyone here ever heard of I countries and we countries? Or another way to say it would be individualistic countries and communal countries. My understanding is that I, or individualistic countries like America, tend to place value on independence and individuality more than belonging and community. We countries, or communal countries, do the opposite. The story the adults acted out during Time for All Ages illustrates the concept of we countries. Ubuntu is a huge part of South African culture and pretty much absent from modern American culture. Now, I don't necessarily think it's good to always put every community first, and I do believe that personal independence is important. But the philosophy behind we countries in Ubuntu has some interesting outcomes when practiced on a country-wide scale. For example, no one in South Africa is homeless. If your dead husband's third cousin needs a place to stay and you have space for him to sleep in your kitchen, that third cousin has a home. As mentioned before, one grandmother we interviewed lived in a house with 17 people. Herself, her children, her grandchildren, and 5 brothers-in-law. None of the brothers-in-law worked. I can't imagine she was happy about that, but she also didn't outright complain to me or kick the brothers out. When we told South Africans about homeless people in America, they didn't believe us. How could the richest country in the world have people who are homeless? A good question, and one that further illustrates the differences in philosophy between our two countries. So South Africa helped teach me that happiness is not material objects, and happiness can come from being in a community. And those are two principles I think we could all agree we could incorporate into our lives more. I think we can agree that if we wanted to, we could take steps to have lives that are less focused on material objects, more focused on community, and in the process, even in an I country like America, we could lead happier lives. But that's not the end of the story, or the entire nature of happiness. The other lesson South Africa taught me is that happiness is in the present moment, and only the present moment, because that is all you really have. The night I sobbed in my room alone, it was because I was overwhelmed by 2 things. First was seeing the reality of people living with the poverty I described earlier. The second thing that broke my heart, though, was seeing people's hearts, families, and communities torn into by AIDS. The reason why we were interviewing grandmothers is because at the time, South Africa had almost a lost generation of people. In 2004, it was estimated about 20% of the adult population would die of AIDS in the next 10 years. And by 2020, 25% of the workforce would die of AIDS. Can you imagine a quarter of the adults in America dead in 10 years? Think about what it would do to businesses, to churches, to schools. So many teachers had to leave the classrooms because they became sick. The grandmothers were the ones that picked up the pieces. They took care of and often watched their children become sick and die, and then took care of their grandchildren, who often became sick and died. Every grandmother we interviewed had lost someone, usually more than one person to AIDS. Most of our interview was focused on the topic in hopes of trying to find out what the community center could do to better meet the needs of the people. More than one woman spoke of the hardship of trying to care for sick children, take care of the grandchildren, and keep the household running. They also spoke of the sadness they felt when loved ones died, of course. From a statistical perspective, in every group photo you've seen today, at least one child or adult most likely had AIDS. In the picture of the classroom, theoretically almost a quarter of the children may have had AIDS. But the statistics here are actually probably wrong, because these statistics look at the entire country of South Africa. And AIDS is and was far more prevalent in the shanty towns and poorer communities. When we visited, it was estimated that about 3 out of every 5 people was sick. That's over half the children in this picture. It is heartbreaking, but there's a good chance that some of those children, or even the teacher himself, is now dead. Which is why I asked myself over and over again, how? How can they be so happy, knowing the future holds so much death? If not their own death, and the death of not one, not two, but many people they love, most dying way too young. I think the answer is that they lived in the moment. One of the most moving stories I heard related to AIDS was from a friend who visited another woman who had adopted over 10 children of all ages, all HIV positive or already sick with AIDS. They lived in a shanty town and most likely faced all the same struggles that the grandmothers we interviewed faced. My friend said the children were so happy though. They were leading such happy lives. And their caregiver, their adopted mom, was happy too. We are enjoying the time we have together, is what the woman told my friend. Enjoying the time they had together. Maybe that, even more than community, is the true nature of happiness. When I think back in my life, my happiest times were when I was fully engaged in the present. I think life sometimes makes it hard for us to do that, though. There's always something to do, something to worry about, something to plan for, someplace to be. You're having lunch with a friend, but thinking about a problem at work. You're spending time with family, working on household finances in our head. You're sitting in church, but thinking about the recital, game, test, etc., coming up this afternoon or tomorrow. People in South Africa are busy too. How can you not be when you live with 17 people in extreme poverty and are taking care of people with AIDS? But the people I met in South Africa were well practiced in mindfully being present, and in this case, I envy them. I try running, meditation, mindfulness, coloring, and still end up having my mind in 2 places at once more often than not. I and perhaps many Americans have to work hard at being present in the moment, while South Africans seem to be taught how to do it at an early age. My happiest moments in South Africa involved both being part of a community and being wrapped up in the moment. And I know the South Africans I met were enjoying the moment too. They enjoyed the moment being interviewed by foreigners, enjoyed the moment dancing on the street to music from the electric keyboard. Do not focus on the fact they will not eat again until tomorrow, but put all their energy into singing I'm happy and I'm loved with their friends. That may be what the true nature of happiness is. Something found in a moment by appreciating the moment and truly being present with whoever we are with.